Forget the peaceful images often painted of the New Testament era. Forget the calm, gentle scenes shaped by modern imagination, because the historical reality was far more brutal. In the 1st century, Judea was not a tranquil Holy Land. It was a political flashpoint, a pressure cooker constantly on the verge of eruption beneath the iron grip of the Roman Empire. This was not a system of governance rooted in fairness or trust. It was a machine of control engineered around fear, where any sign of resistance was crushed before it could even take shape, using calculated and exemplary violence. Rome did not need to be everywhere to maintain its authority, because it had turned fear itself into a governing tool. Along the main routes, people had to travel daily to trade. To survive, crosses stood like grim monuments of power. On them hung bodies left unburied, exposed to the scorching sun and desert winds, decaying in plain sight as a living warning to anyone who dared even think about resisting the empire. This was not merely punishment. It was psychological warfare, carefully designed to embed fear deep into the collective consciousness, so that even in the absence of Roman soldiers, people would police themselves. Imagine a child growing up in that environment, walking past decomposing bodies every day, the stench of death blending with dust and dry air, becoming part of ordinary life. Imagine a farmer, a merchant, or a mother, each fully aware that one wrong word, one misstep at the wrong moment, could turn them into the next body on a cross. This was not governance. It was total psychological suffocation. It's a condition in which people were not only controlled in their actions, but in their thoughts. In that context, Judea was a land compressed under pressure from two sides. On one side, the overwhelming military force of Rome. On the other, a rigid internal religious system, where strict laws and elite authorities controlled the spiritual lives of the people. Everything existed in a fragile equilibrium, where any disruption could trigger chaos. And because of that, any individual capable of influencing the masses, anyone who could destabilize the existing order, was immediately seen as a potential threat. This is the world Yeshua stepped into. Not a peaceful stage for moral teachings, but an invisible battlefield where power, fear, and belief collided. He did not emerge in a vacuum. He appeared within a system already operating with near-perfect efficiency in controlling human behavior. And that is precisely what made his story far more dangerous than it is often portrayed. Well, because when a person enters a system built on fear and begins speaking of a reality beyond that fear, it is no longer just religion. It becomes a challenge, a direct challenge to the deepest foundations of power itself. And that is why, from the very beginning, the presence of Yeshua was not merely an event, it was a threat to an empire. For centuries, Western history has painted a familiar image, a gentle, slender carpenter, almost fragile in a world filled with violence. But when we strip away the layers of tradition and return to archaeological evidence and ancient language, a very different portrait begins to emerge, rougher, more grounded, and far more dangerous. The word used to describe Yeshua's occupation in Greek is Tekton, and this is where many have misunderstood. Tekton does not simply mean a carpenter in the modern sense. It refers to a builder, a craftsman who works with the materials available in his environment. And in 1st century Judea, where the landscape was dominated by dry limestone and forests were nearly non-existent, wood was a rare and expensive resource, not the primary material for construction. This means that a tekton in that context was very likely a stoneworker, someone who shaped raw stone into foundations, walls, and enduring structures for large-scale building projects of the time, especially those commissioned under King Herod. This was not work for the weak. It demanded immense physical strength, relentless endurance, and a level of precision that left no room for error. Every strike of the hammer, every cut into stone had to be calculated, because one mistake could destroy a block that had taken hours or even days to prepare. Now picture a man standing under the scorching Middle Eastern sun, sweat mixing with dust that clings to his skin, hands hardened and scarred from slips of the tool or shards of stone, muscles built not for display but forged through constant, repetitive labor. This was the environment that shaped Yeshua. Not quiet synagogues, but the sound of metal striking stone, the pressure of producing something strong enough to endure time itself. And when seen through this lens, his teachings take on an entirely different meaning. When he speaks of building a house on rock rather than sand, it is not a vague religious metaphor meant to illustrate a simple moral lesson. It is the language of lived experience of someone who understands that foundation determines everything. A weak foundation collapses at the first storm, while a solid one withstands the harshest conditions. This is not just philosophy. It is a survival principle he knew through his own hands. That grounding in reality shaped a very different kind of leader. Yeshua was not an idealist detached from the real world, nor a philosopher speaking only in abstractions. He understood people, understood weakness, understood the pressure of living under control because he lived it, worked within it. And that made him extremely difficult to manipulate. A man accustomed to confronting the hardest material, stone, does not bend easily under invisible pressure from systems of power. More than that, the work of a Tekton is not just about strength, it is about seeing structure. A skilled stoneworker does not only look at the surface, but understands where the weaknesses lie, where fractures are hidden, where force must be applied to shift an entire structure. And when this mindset is applied to how Yeshua viewed society, a striking picture emerges. He did not just see what existed, he saw the fault lines within the system, the points where, if pressure were applied in the right way, the entire structure of power could begin to shake. This is no longer the image of a gentle preacher. This is the image of someone who understands how to build and how systems collapse. And it is precisely this combination of lived experience, inner strength, and the ability to see beneath the surface that made Yeshua a figure no system of power could easily control or predict. What truly began to alarm the Roman intelligence apparatus and the temple elite was not the stories of miracles, but something far more dangerous: the way Yeshua built the people around him. In a world where all power depended on division, control, and the manipulation of social groups, his ability to bring opposing individuals together was not just unusual, it was structurally threatening. This was no longer a matter of religion. It was a political equation that defied conventional logic. Take a closer look at those who followed him, not as familiar biblical names, but as political entities within the first century context. Matthew, a tax collector, was not merely a civil servant. He was a critical link in Rome's financial system, collecting money from his own people to sustain the very empire that oppressed them. In the eyes of Judean society, men like Matthew were not just disliked, they were seen as traitors, symbols of betrayal, living proof that the system could corrupt individuals into turning against their own nation. On the opposite end stood Simon the Zealot, a member of an extremist nationalist movement with completely opposing ideals. The Zealots were not passive dissenters, they were covert operatives willing to use violence against Rome, even assassinating those considered collaborators. In their worldview, there was no neutrality. You were either for liberation or you were the enemy. By that logic, someone like Matthew should have been a target, not a companion. In any historical setting, these two individuals could not coexist in the same space, let alone pursue a shared mission. They represented opposing poles of the same conflict, one aligned with the system, the other committed to rebellion. And that is precisely why what Yeshua did was not merely unconventional. It shattered the very logic that empires rely on to maintain control. Because every system of control depends on division of class, ideology, and loyalty. When people are split into opposing groups, they expend their energy fighting each other rather than challenging the system itself. But Yeshua did the exact opposite. He did not merely tolerate differences, he forced these individuals to sit together, eat together, live together, and ultimately see a reality beyond the labels society had assigned to them. Now imagine the power of that in the context of the time. A tax collector and a zealot sharing the same fire, listening to the same teaching, becoming part of a new kind of community. This did not just weaken political boundaries, it rendered them meaningless. And once those boundaries disappeared, the system lost its most essential tool of control. This is why Rome could not afford to ignore this movement. They were not facing just an individual, but a new social model, one that could not be easily categorized, could not be divided, and therefore could not be controlled by conventional means. An army can be defeated, a rebellion can be crushed, but a community built on unity that transcends ideology is nearly impossible to break from the outside. And this is what made Yeshua's movement a kingdom in the truest sense, not a territory with borders and armies, but a reality that existed in the minds and relationships of people. A kingdom without weapons, yet powerful enough to shake the strongest empires. A kingdom beyond Caesar's control, because it did not operate by Caesar's rules. To those in power, this was no longer something that could be ignored. This was a new kind of threat, one that could not be seen, yet could spread faster than any army. And when a system realizes it cannot control what is emerging, history shows a consistent response: eliminate its source. Tension reached its peak not when Yeshua attracted crowds, nor when he performed what were seen as miracles, but when he directly confronted the true center of power in Judea, the temple in Jerusalem. To understand how dangerous this was, the temple must be seen not merely as a place of worship, but as a complex power structure where religion, economics, and politics were fused into one. It was the place where money flowed, where laws were established, where people were labeled clean or excluded, and most importantly, where the spiritual lives of an entire nation were controlled. Yet the Pharisees and Sadducees were not simply religious leaders. They were the elite class holding real power, maintaining order by controlling laws and rituals. Every aspect of life was regulated, from sacrifices and purification to how individuals were allowed to approach God. And within that system, ordinary people, especially the poor, were trapped in a web of obligations and costs they could not escape. To be considered righteous, they had to pay. To be considered clean, they had to submit to rules they had no authority to define. This was not just religion, it was an economy wrapped in sacred language. And then Yeshua stepped in. He did not ask for permission. He did not negotiate. He did not attempt reform from within. Instead, he acted in a way the system could not tolerate. He bypassed it entirely. When he healed the sick, without requiring them to go through temple rituals, he did not just help individuals, he disrupted the power structure itself. When he forgave sins without religious intermediaries, he directly challenged the monopoly of those who stood at the top. But the turning point was not his actions, it was his words. Before Abraham was, I am. This was not symbolic language. In Jewish tradition, Abraham was the patriarch, the foundation of identity and faith. To place oneself before Abraham was not merely bold, it was a direct inversion of the entire sacred order. For those in power, this was no longer a theological debate. It was a direct threat to their legitimacy. Because if that statement were true, then everything they had built, the laws, the rituals, the authority, would become secondary, even irrelevant. And that was something they could not accept. From that moment on, everything changed. Yeshua was no longer just a controversial teacher. He became a target that had to be eliminated. But the crucial point is this: the sentence against him was not purely religious, it was political at its core. Because under Roman rule, executing a man required justification beyond matters of faith. And the leaders understood this perfectly. They could not kill him simply for saying things they disagreed with. They needed a charge strong enough to compel Rome to act. And in the eyes of an empire constantly alert to any sign of rebellion, a man speaking of another kingdom, gathering followers, and operating outside established control systems. This was the very definition of a threat. So they did not merely oppose him, they began building a case against him. A sentence not written in ink, but shaped by the fear of those in power. A sentence aimed not just at one man, but at preserving an entire system on the brink of collapse. And from that moment, the wheels of history began to turn in a direction that could no longer be reversed. The scourging and crucifixion were not merely forms of execution. They were tools engineered to instill fear at the deepest level of human psychology. Rome did not just want to kill an individual. They wanted to deliver a message that could not be misunderstood. When a man was stripped naked, nailed to wood, and lifted before the public, his body did not die instantly. Death came slowly, agonizingly, as each breath became a desperate struggle. The victim had to push himself upward to inhale, only to collapse again in pain, repeating the cycle until total exhaustion. This was not punishment. It was a performance designed to burn into collective memory that Roman power was absolute, and that anyone who dared challenge it would face the most excruciating death imaginable. And Yeshua was placed at the very center of that performance. From Rome's perspective, the story should have ended there. A troublemaker eliminated, a crowd intimidated, a system preserved. Everything unfolded exactly as it had hundreds of times before. But this time, there was a variable they could not control. 3 days later, the tomb sealed and guarded by trained Roman soldiers was empty. There were no signs of a typical escape. No evidence of a body being stolen in any way that conventional criminal logic could easily explain. But what truly shook the foundations was not just the empty tomb. It was the reaction of those who had followed him. These were people who had panicked, who had fled to save their own lives, who had hidden in fear as their teacher was executed. And suddenly, they changed completely. They did not just return, they stepped into the open. They did not merely continue the story, they declared something even more dangerous, that Yeshua had risen from the dead. And they made that claim in a context where such a statement could lead directly to torture and execution. This is where history becomes difficult to explain through ordinary reasoning. People can die for a false belief. This has happened many times. But there is a clear boundary. People rarely endure brutal death for a lie they themselves know they invented. If the resurrection were a conspiracy, it would be one without rational motive, without personal gain, and most importantly, without an exit, because those involved gained nothing but persecution, imprisonment, and death. So what changed them? That question has echoed through history for thousands of years. From a scattered, fearful group, they became individuals who no longer feared death. And when a person no longer fears death, the greatest weapon of any empire, fear begins to lose its power. This is where Rome miscalculated. They believed that by displaying brutality, they could crush any uprising. But in this case, that very brutality became the catalyst for the opposite effect. A movement began to form. No army, no territory, no weapons, only a message. A message that spread from person to person, from city to city, crossing borders, overcoming language and cultural barriers. A message that could not be stopped by violence, because it did not exist in a single place that could be destroyed. It lived within people, and the more it was suppressed, the more it spread. Over time, the impossible began to unfold. The empire that once spread fear across the ancient world found itself confronting something it could not control. People willing to die without abandoning their belief. Persecutions, executions, blood-soaked arenas, none of it could extinguish the wave that was quietly rising. And then, a historical paradox began to take shape. The Roman Empire, the very symbol of power and dominance, was gradually transformed from within by the very message it had tried to destroy. Not through war, not through armed rebellion, but through the transformation of people. It all began with an empty tomb, with an unknown stoneworker from Galilee, and with an event that even today stands beyond the boundaries of conventional historical explanation. This is not just the end of a story. It is the beginning of something that changed the world. And this is the truth that Bible Reborn invites you to confront, not softened, not simplified, but told in the raw, powerful way it shook an empire to its core.